So the Israelis also tried another thing to try to help break up the support. Even though they had driven the PLO from Lebanon, the PLO still existed as a political force. And so they attempted to weaken the PLO's support in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip by supporting Islamists, connected mostly with the Muslim Brotherhood. The aim was to provide them with enough support that they could redirect it. And it's hard to remember now, but in the 1980s, the United States was supporting Saddam Hussein in his war with Iran. And the aim then was that there was a kind of Islam that was politically quiescent. It concentrated on gender issues, and it concentrated on prayer, and it concentrated on those types of things, but not so much on social justice, not so much on politics. And that kind of Islam should be promoted vis-a-vis the more political kind of Islam that was felt emanating from Iran. And that Israel also adopted that policy in the West Bank, attempting to support Islamists who they thought could help break up the support and the monopoly of power that the PLO had. Now this included people like Sheikh Yassin, the late Sheikh Yassin, Mahmoud Zahar, who's part of Hamas today, one of the leaders of Hamas today. And it included even allowing, for example, members of the Ikhwan to move from one city to another in order to demonstrate against the PLO or in order to compete with Palestinian student groups in local universities, etc. However, by 1987, as it was clear that the occupation was not ending, the Second Intifada erupted spontaneously, not as a result of anything that the PLO had organized. And the Islamists transformed themselves into Hamas. And they formed Hamas to take on a more militant objective of liberating Gaza and the West Bank through military force. Israel immediately arrested Sheikh Yassin and other Hamas leaders, and it continued to try to assassinate PLO leaders that it felt were helping promote the Intifada, including Abu Jihad, who was assassinated in 1988, perhaps by one of the people who's running for prime minister right now in Israel. Now, in 1991, there was a different kind of intervention in Palestinian politics. This one was by the United States. President Bush Sr. decided that there was a need, and it was a vital national security interest of the United States, that there be an end to the state of war and the state of conflict between Israel and the Arab states. So he wanted a peace deal between Israel and the Arab states, and he actually pulled in, even before the Arab Summit resolution, he pulled in all the Arab states, or all the major Arab states, to sit down and negotiate with Israel a final status agreement. They knew they needed Palestinians, and they knew there needed to be a Palestinian component. And so there was a promotion and identification of Palestinian local leaders from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, these people, in fact, turned out to be the creme de la creme. They were the best people that Palestine had yet to offer. Dr. Haidar Abdel-Shafi, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, Dr. Ghassan Khatib, Dr. Nabil Kassis, and others, who were not necessarily formal members of the PLO, but were members of they may have been members of the Palestine National Council. They were local leaders in their own right. And they were brought in under the Jordanian delegation, but they only agreed to participate under the explicit instruction of Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Now, that leadership was trying to negotiate freedom from the occupation with Israel. And those negotiations weren't going all that well. Remember that the person on the other side of the table was Yitzhak Shamir's government. Ultimately, Rabin took over from Shamir, and he had the very clever idea that they might be able to pursue a quicker deal and a better one, more suited to Israel's interests, if they negotiated directly with Yasser Arafat and the PLO than with these luminaries among Palestinians. And so they had parallel secret talks with the PLO to negotiate the Oslo Accords. That agreement brought the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, from Tunisia back into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to control about 17% of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and to run it autonomously. So we're back to the idea of autonomy. The Palestinians would have autonomy, limited autonomy, within those 17%. The Israelis would continue to control the rest. But it was predicated on the idea that this was only a temporary transitional moment until such time as a final status agreement was reached, although the accords never specifically stated what the ultimate goal of those talks would be. So the PLO failed to negotiate for self-determination, and they failed to negotiate specifically for statehood in the agreement, although it is what every single Palestinian on the PLO side thought that they were negotiating. Now, during this process, the Israelis had the most significant successes in terms of cultivating a Palestinian leadership that they could work with and that the international community could work with. This effectively supplanted, however, the U.S. policy that was started in Madrid. Now, obviously, this didn't work too well either. The subsequent negotiations for Palestinian statehood didn't succeed. And by 1999, when the Palestinians expected that they were going to have their state, it was clear that they were not. By 2000, negotiations, in fact, didn't even begin until the summer of 2000 over the idea of statehood. In the meantime, Hamas continued to develop a strong base of support based primarily not on its agenda, but based on the failure of the agenda of the PLO as dominated by Fateh at the time. Now, ultimately, of course, the second intifada broke out in 2000. And by 2002, Israel once again decided that it needed to replace this leadership. So Yasser Arafat's governance was systematically deconstructed over the period of 2002, and Summer and I actually lived through that time. It was less brutal and bloody than the current situation in Gaza, but very similar in goal and methodology. The Israelis went after the Palestinian police first. They attacked all the Palestinian police stations. Then they went after the Palestinian prisons and attacked the Palestinian prisons who were holding prisoners, some of whom were allegedly people trying to commit security offenses against Israel. Then they went after the ministries, and they destroyed many of the ministries. They went into a lot of the ministries that had files and documents, and they stole them, and they effectively took them into Israel. By the time, and they arrested Arafat. For all practical purposes, they put Arafat in the Muqata and placed him under house arrest. And so what ended up happening, of course, was that Fateh and the PLO, first they had their past failure of not being able to negotiate a success, but then they had the second military failure of having their actual autonomous governance completely wiped out by the Israelis. The Israelis during this period of time left Hamas alone, by the way, because they were using one against the other. And finally, of course, what happened was Arafat died, and you effectively only had a shell of a Palestinian autonomy regime in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. 2008, of course, this only happened in the last 4 weeks, so I don't need to go through it, but Israel effectively did the same thing to the elected Hamas government that was ruling over the Gaza Strip. Now, my argument is that Israel's quest to keep creating and replacing Palestinian leaderships in order to have autonomous regimes in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are doomed to fail. And each time they're more violent. Each time the replacement process is more bloody, and usually on the Palestinian side.